In 1978, the average Chinese factory worker earned about 60 cents a day. Today, China manufactures nearly a third of everything bought on Earth. That's not a gradual climb. That's an economic detonation. Most people think China got rich by making things cheaper. That's the Disney version. The real story is about what happens when a government treats an entire economy like a startup, when cheap labor becomes a weapon, and when the world's wealthiest democracies hand over their manufacturing base without reading the fine print. This matters right now because the system that built modern China is collapsing, and what comes next could reshape everything from your grocery bill to whether your country goes to war. Let's start with what actually happened. When Deng Xiaoping opened China to foreign investment in the late 70s, he made a deal with Western companies. That seemed simple. You bring your factories, your technology, your capital. We give you workers who cost almost nothing. Everyone wins, except the deal had clauses nobody talked about. To operate in China, foreign companies had to partner with Chinese firms. They had to share technical knowledge. They had to train Chinese engineers. At the time, General Motors and Boeing and Apple didn't care. They were saving 70, 80, sometimes 90% on labor costs. The margins were obscene. What they didn't see was the technology transfer happening in real time, not through espionage, though that happened too. Through something more mundane, joint ventures, Chinese engineers working alongside German machinery experts, supply chain relationships that required Western firms to teach Chinese suppliers how to meet their standards. By the mid-90s, Chinese factories weren't just assembling Western products, they were learning how to make them from scratch. Here's where the cheap labor story gets interesting. The cost advantage wasn't just about wages. It was about control. Chinese workers couldn't unionize. They couldn't strike. Environmental regulations were suggestions. Workplace safety was optional. A factory in Shenzhen could retool an entire production line in weeks, something that would take months in Ohio and require a dozen permits. Speed became the product. Western companies got addicted to it when Apple designed the iPhone. In 2007, they needed to change the screen from plastic to glass just weeks before launch. Foxconn, their Chinese manufacturer, woke up 8,000 workers at midnight, housed them in on-site dormitories, and had 250,000 iPhones ready in 4 days. No American factory could do that, not because of skill, because of system design. China had built a manufacturing machine optimized for one thing: compliance at scale. But cheap labor was always phase one. Phase two was moving up the value chain. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. Western economists promised this would liberalize China, force it to play by international rules. Instead, China used WTO membership to flood global markets while protecting its own. Foreign companies faced ownership caps, forced partnerships, restricted market access. Chinese companies got subsidies, cheap credit from state banks, and government contracts that guaranteed revenue. The playing field wasn't level, it was designed to tilt. By 2010, China wasn't just making t-shirts and toys. It was producing steel, solar panels, semiconductors, electric vehicles, industries that required enormous capital, advanced technology, long-term planning. The kind of industries democracies struggle to support because voters get impatient and elections change priorities. China doesn't have that problem. The Communist Party plans in decades. They can subsidize an entire industry for 15 years, lose billions, and consider it an investment. They did this with high-speed rail, with shipbuilding, with telecommunications. Huawei, the telecom giant, received $75 billion in state support over 2 decades. No private company could survive that kind of subsidy war. Western competitors didn't stand a chance, and here's the kicker: a lot of that state support came from savings. Chinese citizens, forced into a system with minimal social safety nets, saved nearly 40% of their income. The government funneled those savings into state banks, which loaned to state enterprises at artificially low rates. It's a closed loop. The Chinese people funded their own disruption without realizing it. The result? By 2015, China dominated global supply chains: rare earth minerals, pharmaceutical ingredients, electronics components. If you wanted to manufacture almost anything complex, some part of your supply chain touched China. That's not just economic power, that's leverage. When COVID hit in 2020, the world discovered what dependence actually meant. Masks, ventilators, protective equipment, the basic ingredients for antibiotics, all made in China. Factories shut down, supply chains collapsed, and suddenly every Western government realized they'd outsourced not just jobs but national security. China had spent 40 years turning cheap labor into irreplaceable infrastructure. But now the model is breaking, and Beijing knows it. The average Chinese factory worker today earns about $15 an hour in coastal cities. That's not 60 cents anymore. It's not even competitive with Vietnam or Bangladesh. Wages have grown faster than productivity in many sectors. The demographic crisis is worse. China's working age population peaked in 2015. By 2050, there will be fewer workers and twice as many retirees. The cheap labor advantage is gone, and the high-tech transition isn't complete. China bet everything on moving into advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech. But that requires innovation, not imitation. It requires risk-taking, open information flow, failure tolerance, all things that don't naturally thrive under authoritarian control. You can force people to work 12-hour shifts. You can't force them to invent the next iPhone. So China is stuck in what economists call the middle income trap. Too expensive to compete on cost, not innovative enough to compete on technology. And increasingly isolated as Western governments finally wake up and start restricting access to advanced chips, manufacturing equipment, research partnerships. The irony is thick. China used Western openness to build its manufacturing base. Now that the West is closing off access, China is discovering that centralized control has limits. But here's what keeps people awake in Washington and Brussels. China doesn't need to out-innovate the West in every category. It just needs to dominate a few critical ones: electric vehicle batteries, solar manufacturing, AI surveillance systems. If China controls the infrastructure of the next industrial era the same way it controlled manufacturing in the last one, the power dynamic doesn't shift back. And unlike the last 40 years, this competition is geopolitical. Taiwan, the South China Sea, trade routes, alliances. When your economy depends on manufacturing dominance, you need captive markets and secure supply lines. That requires force projection. Cheap labor built China's factories. Those factories funded its military. That military now threatens the global order that made the factories possible in the first place. The feedback loop is complete. So what happens next? Decoupling, probably. Messy, expensive, decade-long decoupling. Supply chains rerouted through India, Mexico, Vietnam, factories rebuilt in Texas and Bavaria at twice the cost. Inflation that doesn't go away, products that cost more and arrive slower. The efficiency is gone. The question is whether the stability was ever real, because the uncomfortable truth is this: the world built an economic system that assumed authoritarian China would play by democratic rules. That assumption was always wrong. We just didn't care because the prices were too good. Now the bill is coming due, and it's not denominated in dollars. It's denominated in leverage,